Roncalli says that the problems which worried the church and the tremendous difficulties which beset it are the problems and difficulties of the church today, except that they have become even more disturbing. Except perhaps they have become even more disturbing. So we addressed all the problems with that. And Roncalli's biographer says, the questions posed by history, he seems to imply, will not go away because they have been declared errors, with the word errors in quotation marks. As though it's just St. Pius X, or Pius X and his cronies are just a little behind the times. And yeah, they have to just let them get this out of their system, and eventually everything will come clear in the end that these things which have been condemned as errors are not actually errors. And that'll all be made clear in time. So just be patient with these backwards people whose minds are shrouded in darkness. They can't get over things such as the idea that everything must be in accordance with the truth, that divine revelation is in fact infallible, and that to deviate from that is a problem. Just let them get past primitive notions like that. In essence, in effect, they would never ever say that. Never. But that is clearly what it's implied just by putting the word errors in quotation marks there. And the next remark is also very interesting. Don Roncalli could not have spoken in this way and risked Roman censure unless he had allies. So this is just the kind of thing that the Sodalite Simpianum, in other words, would pick up on and take people to task who would say them, even in a relatively veiled way such as this. But as we've said, this is actually not all that discreet, all things considered. It's perhaps less bold than other modernists around the same time, but not all that discreet. Everybody knows exactly what he's talking about. His first ally was his bishop, Radini Tedeschi. But Radini had his circle of friends, had his own, perhaps we could even say, had his own circle of friends, among whom was Cardinal Désiré Mercier. We covered him. We mentioned him before. And we've seen, in the Modern Errors course, you probably either have seen or will see him, so we won't go into detail on him at this point. But you see, the people with whom Roncalli is aligned, they're all leftists in just about every possible sense. So Roncalli was looking at how he became what he became. It was due to influences from the very first day of his ecclesiastical career, practically. Even as a young seminarian, the people with whom he fell in were the worst possible. It was highly unlikely that his family living in a remote area of Italy, that they would have corrupted him like this, that would have been their own fault. The obvious conclusion is that he was corrupted in the seminary system, just happened to go into seminary training in areas that happened to be infested with modernists, and was in that sense a victim. So in that sense he's someone to pity, but clearly swallowed it and made it all his own, when the condemnations were clearly there to set everyone straight. And we'll see that here soon, that eventually one of St. Pius X's men, we'll say, came into the seminary where he was teaching, the seminary in Bergamo, and gave 2 lectures, the idea being setting everyone straight. And that some of the responses to that were favorable. In other words, thank you for these lectures. Thank the Holy Father, please, for having sent this lecturer. Now everything is clearer. We see where the problems are, those kinds of things. So in other words, there was absolutely no lack of opportunity to be set straight. But clearly, we'll see, not only did Roncalli himself refuse to be set straight, but in crafty, deceitful ways, effectively disguised himself and gave all the necessary appearances of being submissive and obedient to the Holy Father and so forth, while in reality changing none of his ideas. So, these are the people with whom he is in. Radini Tedeschi, Cardinal Mercier, Cardinal Ferrari. These are all the people with whom he's not only aligned, but in fact on personally close terms with. Or Bonamelli, we'll see here. Roncalli spent 3 days with Bishop Bonamelli in Cremona, June 1st to 3rd, 1908. And you may remember some of those ideas that that Bishop Bonomelli had. Remember, in his moral theology, he said, this is on page 28 of the main section of the notes, "The older I get, the more I am convinced that theologians have enormously increased mortal sins, as if hell, with an eternity of pain, were a mere nothing." He says, "Human law, which would condemn a man to death for grave injury done to a fellow man, would be horrifying." There are problems with that statement alone, his first statement, but then his second one also. Remember, but is not the teaching of these theologians equally horrifying, who for a youthful transgression, for a holy day mass not heard, etc., etc., would condemn a Christian to hell? So remember, by youthful transgression, the obvious meaning of that is sins of impurity, to whom, unfortunately, the young are given. Certainly, these are sins, but one wonders if there is a proportion between these sins and the dreadful pains of hell. So that's Bishop Bonomelli. Remember, writing this, I don't have the date of the moral theology, I don't even want to call it a moral theology work, the date of the pile of garbage, whenever he wrote that with the date on that, I can't really describe it so much. The date of that work was, but early 20th century at the latest, obviously. He was saying that, this is author of anonymous tracts against the teachings of the Church, friends of modernists, prompt to retract his words, but not with sincerity, hostile to the moral teachings of the Church, not only of the theologians, which horrified him. That was Bishop Bonomelli. That's Father Ricosa's accurate description of Bishop Bonomelli. Bishop Guindani was his friend and student. It was Bishop Guindani who sent Roncalli, you may remember, to Rome to study, to complete the final years of his studies, his preparation for the priesthood, and also now with whom Roncalli spends 3 days in Cremona in 1908. So Bonomelli had tried to persuade Cardinal Rampolla that the intellectual crisis, meaning modernism, should not be met with repressive and negative measures, that the mood of fear was bad for scholarship. You can't even say it with a straight face. And the Church. That this mood of fear is bad for scholarship and the Church, and that an honest and fruitful liberty was needed if Catholic scholars were to progress. Yet, in typical modernist fashion, using code to disguise what they actually mean, this is all saying we need to get St. Pius X to abandon his program against modernism so that modernism can flourish. And that's it. That's all that really means. And so notice here, also Rampolla agreed, but was powerless to influence events. So, how it happened that Vatican II only occurred in the 1960s, as late as the 1960s, is actually, as you uncover more and more details, that comes across as being very late indeed. How did it not happen decades earlier? How did it not start in 1932 or even 1922, potentially, except for St. Pius X? So, going into the realm of alternate possibilities of alternate history, almost, of what could have happened or what might have happened had events gone differently. It's always very difficult, of course. We can never know for certain, but there's a high probability. Looking at all this, we can say safely that Vatican II would have happened much earlier, without the reign of St. Pius X to get in the way of the modernist agenda and damage it sufficiently. Of course, his idea was to get rid of it, to suppress it entirely, and he certainly made every effort to do that. But there are certain things, actually, which we see could have been done still further. And that's some of that we'll see here. Some people managed to slip through, of course. Roncalli himself, for example. Bonomelli already, this is, it just becomes more and more telling, every new fact we come across here. Bonomelli already in 1908 looked forward to an ecumenical council. Perhaps a great ecumenical council which would discuss rapidly and publicly the great problems of religious life, would draw the attention of the world to the Church, stimulate faith, and open up new ways for the future. And you don't need me to tell you that almost exactly 50 years later, Roncalli took up Bonomelli's ideas in almost identical terms. So also we can dismiss in advance John the 23rd's claims that the idea of a council was something that with which he was inspired by the Holy Ghost in an instant, and so decided to do it. He was thinking about it 50 plus years prior. One of the first casualties of Pascendi was Giacomo della Chiesa, the future Benedict XV, who was working in the Secretariat of State. His principal crime was that he remained on friendly terms with Cardinal Rampolla. In fact, he was known as Rampolla di Rampolla. Rampolla, something along the lines of Rampolla's Rampolla. In other words, very much in his school of thought. Rampolla of Rampolla, literally. So we studied the reign of Benedict XV last year, which is itself very interesting. And Benedict XV was definitely no modernist. There is no question of that whatsoever. But he was definitely a protege, as his nickname, so to speak, suggests, and was therefore suspect during the reign of St. Pius X. Shy and unprepossessing in appearance, he, that is, Della Chiesa, found the anti-clerical atmosphere of Bologna a strain, and the Pope, St. Pius X, refused to give him the cardinal's hat that normally went with the appointment. So, there's a number of reasons to suspect this, but that was most likely a case, as we've said before, of promoveatur ut abmoveatur. Kicking him upstairs, getting him out of the way, technically promoting him, but not to the extent to which you usually promote a person in that situation. And so getting rid of him without technically disgracing him, but almost by promoting him in a way that is conspicuously not to the usual extent. And so that's just, in other words, the lack of the usual extent there is one of the other indications that this was a case of getting kicked upstairs. So clearly, St. Pius X didn't want to make him a cardinal, but he did. He relented, as this author puts it, in the spring of 1914. And as we've said before, in fact, he put Della Chiesa's name in his own hand on the list of those to be created cardinal at the final consistory that St. Pius X held in 1914, over the objections of Cardinal Mary Doval. And we've talked about this multiple times before, but that may have been, it's impossible to know what was exactly in the mind of St. Pius X when he did that, but it may be that he knew that the next candidate to be elected, knowing the pattern that was well established by that point, that knowing that the papacy was likely to swing back towards the other party, so to speak, he was providing a least bad candidate in some sense. In other words, somebody who could be elected, who would be pleasing to the softliners, but who was not Cardinal Rampolla or anybody of that school. Was not Rampolla or Ferrari or any of those people. So in autumn 1908, we've alluded to this before, 800 workers at a textile factory in Ranica, just outside Bergamo, went on strike. And actually, I'm not sure whether it's Ranica or Ranica, but in any case, 800 factory workers went on strike. They had founded a union known as the Workers' League. As we've said before, the workers coming together in defense of their legitimate interests is not something intrinsically evil, of course, but they very easily fall to leftism. Unions have become that. We talked about the fact that the existence of unions is a result of economic liberalism, ultimately. That when you're allowed to do whatever you want economically, then employers will start to build up huge corporations to make themselves as wealthy as possible and pay their people as absolutely little as possible, driving those people who work for them to band together in desperation in order to provide, to demand living wages. But of course, if they themselves have no limitations on what they can do, then they will become very powerful and start making all kinds of demands far beyond simply the basics, which they were originally banding together to try to obtain for themselves. And then also, when you have large organizations like that of working class people, that creates a very widespread, very powerful entity for the likes of people such as Karl Marx to appeal to and to make all kinds of promises to the working classes. They have someone to whom they have these organizations to whom they can speak directly to make all kinds of promises of a communist paradise, which ended up just becoming all of the communist nations that we know and are horrified of. Yeah, both current, the ones that exist today, and the previous, and those that have existed since the foundation of it, including, of course, the Soviet Union, communist Russia. So that's it's just a way of, when you actually look at what ends up being the case in just about every single communist nation everywhere, you just end up with effectively a third world country. Not literally, actually, you may know this, but the very categorization of first, second, third world countries was actually originally something that came about during the Cold War. It had nothing to do originally. The intention was not to designate quality of life or the development of a country, but was simply meant who was on which side during the Cold War. So the United States, Western Europe, first world. The second world, communist Russia, communist China, nations aligned with them. And the third world was just anybody who wasn't aligned with either side, which just, in fact, turned out to be nations where quality of life was rather poor and which were underdeveloped. So it's come to mean that. Whereas first and second world have now come to mean more, come to mean with regard to that, because of that, more developed or perhaps developed but not fully. But then third world means just really underdeveloped, or as the euphemistic term has come to be developing nations, meaning undeveloped or underdeveloped. I mean, they still need to be developed, but they're getting there. So it's just trying to put an optimistic spin on that, try to make it sound nicer. So what ends up happening in a third world country always is you have a super rich elite, and then you have very just dirt poor working classes and almost nothing in between. That is characteristic of a third world country. And of course, it speaks to all the other problems that you would find in such a country. And so that's what communist nations always end up being. Ultimately, communism is a means for people who want to gain power to set themselves up as being filthy rich and powerful. That's ultimately what happens, for them to live off of everybody else, in other words. And so the people to whom they originally made promises end up just in abject poverty and worse off than they were before. But they were promised all of these things, that you were going to get a working man's paradise, and it never comes to be, ever. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. It becomes extremely miserable for them, in fact. But those are the promises that are made in order to get them to rally to these revolutions. So that's what we're looking at here. Again, 1909. Remember, this is a few years after the revolution, the failed Russian Revolution of 1905, or failed to an extent. Certainly it didn't overthrow the Tsar of Russia, but it did indeed bring about actually the foundation of the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament. That was a concession made by the Tsar to those who were agitating for changes at the time. So that almost overthrew Tsar Nicholas II, but it didn't. He made enough concessions. The defeat of the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War was not so catastrophic as Russia's effective defeat in the First World War, that the Tsar's abdication was just unconditionally called for. He granted enough concessions that the defeat in that war was catastrophic, certainly, but not to the same extent as what came later. He made the right concessions. They were happy. The people were appeased, and things continued on for a while. Until 1917, of course, and then everything just fell apart. But that was due to another war. And right now, in 1909, we're in between the Russo-Japanese War and the First World War. But just 4 years after that first revolution, another revolution of sorts is taking place. This is not a full-blown revolution, but workers striking that savors heavily of revolution, definitely. So it began on September 21st, 1909, the strike, and there was very little in the Union coffers. In other words, they didn't have much money. So after a month, Lecco de Bergamo started a fund to support the strikers, and Regini Tedeschi made the first contribution of 500 lire. And the right-wing press was furious, so those conservative voices were furious. The Bishop's Alms thundered the publication Perseverance, is a consecration of the strike, a blessing given to a frankly socialist cause, which it was. Pressure was put on, yet the author of the book says, Pius X to disavow this somewhat improbable candidate for the role of Red Bishop. Remember, someone who had been consecrated a bishop by St. Pius X himself, actually. So during his 1910, rather than going to all that, let's make it clear, we actually are breaking away from that. We're not going to go into all the details of that, obviously, but we are going to consider other aspects of Roncalli's early career at this point. But this just goes to show that the people with whom Roncalli was involved from the earliest years of his priesthood were leftists in every sense. And his bishop was not only friendly with all the modernizers and modernists, but was just known as a red bishop for favoring socialist agitation. So, some of the things we're going into a lot of detail here, obviously, but some of the things into which we're not going into detail are the ways in which, for example, that Roncalli came immediately to the defense of Regini Tedeschi for supporting the strike. And the author of the book also defends Regini Tedeschi for having supported it. So it's all just leftists in every possible way. Ecclesiastical leftists, political leftists. He was involved with leftists from the start. So during his 1910 retreat made at Martinengo with his bishop, Roncalli wrote of the wisdom, timeliness, and nobility of the measures taken by the Pope to safeguard the clergy in particular from the infection of modern errors, the so-called modernist errors, which in a crafty and tempting way are trying to undermine the foundations of Catholic doctrine. So that sounds good. But even there is a strategy to it. The author of the book says, word for loaded word, especially adjective for adjective. And I'm not sure which grammar book he studied out of, but infection is actually a noun, but never mind. Infection, crafty, tempting. He, that is Roncalli, was echoing what Pius X wanted good seminary professors to believe. So we'll see here, this is something less than perfectly sincere. So then we have... Sorry. Okay, so actually, it seems like I duplicated a page here without realizing it. Moreover, despite the punitive measures of the last 3 years, that is, modernism, had not been overcome. The painful experiences of this year, suffered here and there, the grave anxieties of the Holy Father, and the pronouncements of the religious authorities have convinced me, without the need of further proof, that this wind of modernism blows more strongly and more widely than it seemed at first sight, and that it may very likely strike and bewilder even those who were at first moved only by the desire to adapt the ancient truth of Christianity to modern needs. And the author of the biography puts those words in italics himself. In other words, highlighting that Roncalli clearly still believes that that is a good motive, that is something that needs to be done. We have to adapt the ancient truth of Christianity, as he puts it, to modern needs. And remember, he had an example from his own bishop. Remember, he says, well, certain things he's doing and saying, you might give the impression that he just loves novelty, but really all he's doing is adapting in essence, adapting the faith to modern needs, adapting it to the needs of his diocese in particular. So Roncalli at this point is giving a degree of lip service to the program of St. Pius X, talking about the grave anxieties of the Holy Father, that these are, in other words, I recognize that this is very serious, that the Holy Father has reason to be anxious, that the pronouncements of the religious authorities have convinced me, without any need of further proof, I'm thoroughly convinced that this wind of modernism blows more strongly and widely, that this is a powerful force, a dangerous one to be reckoned with, that in essence here, nobody is safe from it, but even those who are moved by this desire. Which clearly he says is still, even those, in other words, even people of goodwill, people who have the right ideas, which is, and in his mind, clearly that is a right idea and a good desire. Even they can be taken down by this, because clearly those who have that desire are not modernists or modernizers. That they are not already, just by having that idea, already under the influence of modernism. They are, in fact, in reality. But see, oh yes, modernism is a terrible thing, but I'm not part of it, and the people I'm with aren't part of it either. So you see Roncalli's craftiness. He was always very crafty like this. Many, some of them good men, have fallen into error, perhaps unconsciously. Well, they had plenty of time to become conscious. Plenty of time to realize what was actually going on. So Roncalli's biographer says, Roncalli was here placing on the altar and slaying the ideal of adaptation and aggiornamento that was his own, as well as that of Radini Tedeschi, Ferrari, Bonamelli, and Mercier. How could he be so supine? Now, it's a rhetorical question. He's going to, at least it seems that way at first, he's actually going to answer it. At the first, that strikes you as a rhetorical question, and he probably wanted to ask it that way. How could this be? You see, this biographer, he's definitely on the side of Vatican II. Remember, he's an apostate priest, in fact. So how could Roncalli be so supine? He's giving this up. He's giving up his ideal of adaptation and aggiornamento. Adaptation, remember, aggiornamento can mean updating. It's one way to translate it. Updating. So the author answers, though, this question, which at first seems to be a rhetorical question. The answer can be seen by looking at the dates. But actually, you see, the answer is not exactly, well, it's a bad thing that he had those ideas to begin with, obviously. But what he should have done at this point was, of course, give them up and realize that the faith doesn't need to be updated. The Catholic Church is, in a true sense, timeless. Yes, the doctrines of the faith can be expounded and more clearly, more explicitly proposed and developed in a good sense, in a true sense, as time goes on, in reaction to challenges to the faith, but not adapted or updated in the sense that Roncalli and company mean it. So he should have just given up those ideas at this point. But we'll see, he didn't, and the things that he did, despite not giving them up, are very bad. And now the author is going to explain what exactly he was doing and how he did it. So the retreat was made, this retreat that we mentioned at Martinengo, was made from October 2nd to October 10th, 1910. On September 1st, the anti-modernist oath had been published. It was a fiercely uncompromising text. It left no loopholes for interpretation, on purpose. That's true. You take it, the author here says it had to be taken on the reception of minor orders. At this point, when you're ordained a subdeacon is when you take it, upon ordination to the subdiaconate. Also, office holders when they took up office, and professors at the start of the academic year. So that's true. When you read it, or especially when you take it, it is indeed exactly that, fiercely uncompromising, leaving no loopholes at all. It was meant not to leave any loopholes. So Don Roncalli was due to take it the following November. It laid particular emphasis on the fixity of doctrine, transmitted to us in the same sense and meaning from the apostles, and the absolute and immutable truth, first preached by the apostles. So this is, you look at that, you say, yes, obviously, we accept anybody with the virtue of faith accepts the doctrine of the Catholic Church, which is divine revelation, accepts anyone with the virtue of faith, accepts that as it has been transmitted to us in the same sense and meaning from the apostles, because its meaning is unchangeable. And the absolute, as we've just said, the absolute and immutable truth first preached by the apostles. Anybody with the virtue of faith says that's great. That makes you want to go and take the anti-modernist oath right now. But notice what the author says here concerning an obvious reference to Roncalli. It laid particular emphasis on the fixity of doctrine, did the anti-modernist oath, which the historian, no less than the philosopher, or the reader of Newman's Essay on Development, found difficult to accept. This speaks to some serious problems with Roncalli, as well as other people. Remember that Newman, Cardinal Newman, said that during the reign of St. Pius X, he said, "We'll just hold this right. We'll just hold fast. Another council will come along down the line and trim the ship," as he put it. Just use your imagination as to what he must have been referring to when he said trim the ship. So one clause attempted, this is, you see the author of the book here, the Roncalli's biography, hates it too. One clause attempted to put an end, once and for all, to any kind of debate in the church. That's not true, but certainly any kind of, adherence to modernism, yes. But watch what follows, read what follows. This is also excellent. "With like respect, I submit and adhere wholeheartedly to the condemnation and all the prescriptions which are contained in the encyclical letter Pascendi and in the decree Lamentabili, especially those which bear on the history of dogma." So that's great. Yeah, again, something else makes you want to go and take the anti-modernist oath right now. But the author of the book says this was a considerable novelty. You see, modernists point. Now, we're not saying new things. You're the ones introducing novelties here by insisting on such things as actually accepting divine revelation as proposed by the Catholic Church, which was, in fact, divinely instituted for that purpose. So as Archbishop Mignot of Albi wrote, "They are organizing a white terror." You see this stamping and screaming here. "We used to believe that in order to be a good Catholic, it was sufficient to believe all the truths which God revealed or the Church taught. It seems now that more is needed, namely that the Church should not tell us only what must be believed, but how we should think. The Pope is demanding an absolute assent to formularies which are not of faith, at least not in all their parts, so that authority binds us while not binding itself." Yeah, just stamping and screaming. What St. Pius X is requiring, yes, is, as we saw, submission and wholehearted adherence to the condemnations and all the prescriptions contained in Pascendi, Lamentabili. And yes, also requiring, in fact, as popes can do, requiring the use of Thomism. In fact, saying that that hatred of Thomism is a sure sign of a modernist. Because if you have the virtue of faith, as we've said before, what problem could you possibly have with that? What problem could you possibly have with being told by the Church how to think? What is the issue with that? That prevents you from going wrong. That's a good thing. I mean, complaining like this is like complaining about being given a vehicle that cannot possibly go astray. It will keep you on the road, infallibly safe, infallibly free of it, making any mistakes, and saying, "I don't want that. I want to be able to crash. I can't crash. I can't do what I want. I can't drive into a ditch when I want to." That's the level of. In fact, it's far worse than that. But it's a similarly nonsensical way of thinking. Yeah, much worse objectively, but yeah, just to give an illustration. That's how bad this is. And then going back to making excuses for Roncalli, the biographer says, "In such a crunch situation, Don Roncalli inevitably had to side with the Pope." In other words, he has to pay some degree of lip service, has to take this anti-modernist oath and say that he believes what it says in order to avoid detection. Yeah, that's not, he won't say those exact words, but that's definitely what he's driving at. There's no question here. As a priest professor, there was no way he could elude the oath. Because that's something that needs to be eluded. In the mind of the biographer, apparently, in Roncalli's own mind also, and you remember this is his biography that is at least, as Father Acosta puts it, of official character. That this is definitely authoritative. Yeah, Roncalli's authoritative biography. So he quotes, that is, Roncalli quotes the maxim of St. Alphonsus Liguori, "The Pope's will, God's will." But then the author says, he shows his own colors more and more as you go on, but this was less ultramontane than it superficially appeared. So ultramontane, or ultra, is someone, it's an adjective, or someone who is an ultramontanist. That was a term cooked up by liberals who can't stand the fact that faithful Catholics look to Rome for their guidance in matters of faith. among other things too, of course, chiefly matters of faith. In other words, ultramontane, ultra beyond, looking, and montane referring to the mountains, looking beyond the Alps to the south to Rome. If you look to Rome for your guidance in matters of doctrine, we'll spit at you by calling you an ultramontanist. That was the idea. It was meant to something derogatory. So if you're called an ultramontanist ever, if you ever have that applied to you, wear it like a badge of honor. Probably the only thing better than that might be getting excommunication from the Novus Ordo. That's pretty good too. But he says this is less ultramontane than it superficially appeared. So yes, that sounds very good. And he's quoting St. Alphonsus, but this is also typical of Roncalli. Superficially conservative and pious underneath that just rottenness. So he says he's not actually as loyal to the Holy See as you might think by reading that. St. Alphonsus made this remark, or enunciated this maxim in the context of the suppression of the Jesuits on July 22nd, 1773. So this was, yes, the Jesuits, as we've talked about, or we haven't covered it this year, but if you study the history of the Jesuits, it's very much a mixed bag. Many saints, obviously, some of whose pictures we have posted in the halls of our seminary here, who died glorious martyrs' deaths, evangelizing the Indians of North America, the North American martyrs. We have their pictures here. Either all Jesuit priests or at least helpers to those Jesuits, all of them associated with the Jesuits. Of course, the founders of the Jesuits, St. Ignatius himself, St. Francis Xavier, some of the early members. Yes, definitely, in many ways, a glorious history of service to the Church. There's no question of that. But they have certain other problems, which take a while to explain, but problems in the realm of speculative theology, problems which you see in some of your theology courses. And of course, they remained Catholics, certainly up to Vatican II, they were in fact Catholics, in fact had the virtue of faith, even if some of their errors were so badly wrong that, as Garrigou explains, when speaking of one of their particular errors, Molinism, he says that applied consistently, that leads you to atheism. So they've definitely gone wrong. Of course, they never became atheists, certainly not prior to Vatican II. Since then, though, who knows? Quite possibly. But they were always Catholics. There's just no question of that. But they had certain definite issues as well. You study their history, that comes out too. But the reason for their suppression was not because of Molinism, was not because of their problems in speculative theology. They were shut down by Pope Clement XIV, who succumbed to the pressure of the liberal monarchs of Western Europe, who disliked one of the good aspects of the Jesuits, which was their very effective teaching. They did that. Is another one of their good aspects, one of the other things that they definitely did well in the service of the Church, which was to educate the young. They were very good at providing a solid Catholic education to the youth. Again, that was precisely as what they were founded by St. Ignatius, as an order of catechists, of educators, not of people who do speculative theology. Once they got into that, they started having problems. But just as catechists, as teachers, they were very good. Historically, always very good. So it was because of some of their good aspects that the liberal monarchs who had been infested again by the late 18th century, by the fourth quarter of the 18th century, there had been infected with all of the ideas of the Enlightenment. They realized that as long as the Jesuits are around, we're not going to get our way, because our people will be too well educated in the Catholic faith, too well educated, period, and too well formed in the Catholic faith for as long as the Jesuits are around. So they clamored for the suppression of the Jesuits for that reason. It was not because the monarchs of Western Europe were up on Molinism or anything like that. It was because they didn't like the good things. So St. Alphonsus was himself not happy with that, but it was done, so he said, look, the Pope can do that. Absolutely speaking, the Pope can suppress any order he wants at a moment's notice. Absolutely speaking, that he can do that. The Pope has the plenitude of jurisdiction in the Church. He can do whatever he wants in disciplinary matters. But that doesn't mean that every decision he makes is necessarily the best. And this was arguably a bad decision due to the motives for which it was done. Yeah, you might want, if there had been reason to suppress the Jesuits, it was not for the reasons that were given. Now, whether there ever was a whole other topic of debate, which we're definitely not entering into here. But that it was definitely something that Clement XIV's successor, Pope Pius VI, certainly himself did not agree with, which was obvious from the fact that in certain places where technically it never went into effect, he just let that remain the case. He was okay with that. And in fact, there was a cardinal at one point who gave him a whole list of reasons why he could just let that be, and that was okay. And he was happy to hear that. So it was clearly a decision, a disciplinary decision, which definitely not everybody agreed with, either at the time it happened or subsequently. But see, that's how Roncalli sees the reign of St. Pius X and the measures taken by St. Pius X against modernism. He sees that as something analogous to arguably anyway, the poor decision to suppress the Jesuits. Just as it's unfortunate that Pope Clement XIV suppressed the Jesuits for those reasons at the time, so it's also unfortunate, and we just have to live with it, these things that St. Pius X is doing to these, at the very worst, some poor souls who have been led astray and deluded in good faith. That's how Roncalli sees it.